thank you very much for inviting me to present this work. This is joint work with my close friend and colleague, Rohini Pandey, who's at the Kennedy School, and graduate students John Papp at Princeton and Natalia Riggle, who's at MIT. And so before I start, let me just say that I am happy to take questions throughout. In fact, I'm, of course, used to that. I think there's a little bit of complication with the microphone, but please, especially if it's a clarifying question, I'll just try to repeat it for the international audience. And then I'll leave time for question and answers afterwards, or after the discussion. So this project was motivated by, very generally, by an interest in understanding barriers to micro-enterprise expansion in developing countries. In the developing world, a huge fraction of the labor force is employed in micro-enterprises, and so understanding barriers to their expansion has implications for understanding growth and poverty more generally. Now, a frequently cited barrier to micro-enterprise expansion is the lack of credit or credit constraints of micro-entrepreneurs. This is certainly what comes out of focus groups, but has also been shown to be an important empirical correlate of micro-enterprise expansion. And as a result, the recent massive expansion of microfinance throughout the developing world, especially in South Asia, should imply big growth in this sector. In fact, what a couple of recent randomized controlled trials of microfinance have found is very little impact on business growth. So it does appear that relaxing the credit constraints for micro-entrepreneurs does not result in an immediate increase in business investment and expansion of profits. This contrasts quite sharply with evidence from a different kind of infusion of credit, which is not credit, but infusion of capital, which are studies that have shown that giving grants to micro-entrepreneurs, that is not loans, but cash grants, does seem to result in business investment and expansion of profits. And so it's a little bit of a puzzle why we see such different pieces of evidence regarding the role of credit constraints in micro-enterprise growth. And so part of our motivation was to try to fit these two pieces of evidence together. We do this by taking a look at whether it's not credit constraints per se that are unimportant, but the form in which credit is most frequently offered to micro-entrepreneurs. So what we do in this paper is investigate whether the term structure of microfinance loans has an influence on its economic impact. Now, let me just step back a minute. For those of you who aren't familiar with microfinance or the classic microfinance lending model, microfinance is most typically offered through group lending, although not necessarily through joint liability. So I think a lot of people have in mind joint liability contracts when they think about something like the Grameen Bank. In fact, most microfinance institutions now offer group loans, but they're individual liability loans. Kind of key characteristics of microfinance loans are graduated loan size. So they typically start borrowers off at very small kind of token loans that are designed to show that they are responsible borrowers, and then slowly graduate them to larger and larger loan sizes. Another key feature is that the repayment plan typically involves several very small, high-frequency installments. So this is very different than a small business loan in a developed country, which would typically have, maybe one bullet payment at the end of the loan term. And these begin immediately or soon after loan disbursement. So you're handed the money and you immediately have to give some of it back. And every week or every 2 weeks, you have to repay the loan. So what this implies is there's absolutely no grace period, which you would find in almost any other loan in a developed country. And more generally, there's just very little flexibility in terms of moving payments around, giving a larger payment at a certain part of the year, for instance, when business is high, and giving smaller payments when business is low. When you have a health shock, there's very limited ability to skip payments. That is, what I mean specifically is that the penalties for delinquency and default are pretty strict. So what we do in this project is consider whether introducing a small amount of flexibility into the standard Grameen Bank style microfinance loan. And we do this by offering clients a 2-month grace period at the start of their credit contract. We'll change how they spend the loan and both the amount and the type of business investments that they make using the loan amount. What we hypothesize is that a grace period would allow clients to invest in riskier, to make riskier investments. So to invest in less liquid and potentially higher return projects. And we study this, which could have important implications for business expansion and long-term profits. We studied this with a randomized controlled trial in which we randomly assigned clients to 2 different contract types, the very standard microfinance contract that I described before, and then the exact same contract with a 2-month grace period. And the randomization was done across loan groups. So the control group started repayment, as is typical in this microfinance institution, 2 weeks after they received their loan. And the treatment group started loan repayment 2 months after the loan. And everything else about the loan was kept the same. That is, once repayment began, all the clients repaid at the same frequency on a fortnightly basis, the same amount every 2 weeks. And again, the idea was just to make microfinance loans look a little bit more like small business loans in a developed country, and observe whether or not that has an effect on how they are spent. However, what's worth noting, I've told you kind of 2 of our predictions regarding investments, that clients should be encouraged to invest in riskier assets and also expand the amount that they invest, which is risky in and of itself. However, this undertaking more risk should also have implications for default. So we should also observe potentially higher default. And we study this by tracking clients and looking at their investment decisions immediately after they receive the loan, and then tracking them for 3 years and seeing the effects on their long-run profit and their default rates. And just to give you a preview of the findings, we find that a 2-month delay, introducing this pretty subtle variation in the microcredit contract, has a large impact on business spending. We see significantly increased business spending in the short run, and we see very much higher income and profits in the long run. We also see higher variance of income and profits, which is consistent with the investment model we have in mind. So that is, clients are investing in a wider range of asset types and taking on more risk. And so we see kind of winners and losers from this strategy. On average, income is higher, but we also see a larger amount of businesses failing, and we see a significantly higher rate of default. And we also look at some measure of risky business practices, which I will show you. But let me give you a little background on the logistics of the experiment. We partnered with one of the leading microfinance institutions in Kolkata, India. The loan size in our experiment was, almost all of the loans were this amount, around $175. There was a little bit of variation depending on whether the clients were first-time or second-time borrowers. But the majority of clients were second-time borrowers. The annual interest rate that the MFI quotes is 22%. I think it's closer to 28% when you take into account all of the kind of hidden fees and there's basically a lot of fees for each loan that you apply for. Group size in this bank is 5 clients. And the penalty for default, it's interesting, every MFI that I've ever talked to or worked with, the penalties for default are not made at all explicit to the clients. Very much, there's a lot of uncertainty among clients about what exactly happens when you miss payments, when you're delinquent, or if you, or even what qualifies as default. How many payments can you miss? How long do you have before you will be fully penalized for not repaying a loan in full? What the bank says is that, or threatens at least, is that the individual will be cut off from any further loans if they, even if they eventually pay. So if they are delinquent or don't pay by the due date, then they will be cut off from all further loans. I don't really think that's credible, and we don't see that fully in the database. But it does seem to be a real threat. So we do see clients definitely expressing concern that this default penalty will apply. So I think this is basically what clients have in mind. So our research design was very straightforward. Over the course of 5 months, we formed 169 new loan groups that encompassed 845 borrowers. As I said, the majority were second-time borrowers, although we did have, I think about 20% of our clients were first-time borrowers. After group formation, after the group had been approved and they'd undergone what's called group training, where it's actually called group recognition training, where they kind of get to know each other and basically become familiar with the terms of the loan and the expectations of the MFI. So that is the group, the bank signs off on this group and the loan amount to this group. At that point, the loan officers call our project manager and we give them the contract assignment. So 84 groups were assigned to receive the standard contract and 85 groups, sorry, the opposite. 85 groups received the standard contract and 84 groups received the grace period contract. One important thing to note, as I said, we did try to keep these things as identical as possible, but there's a little bit of a trade-off. There's kind of two ways you could structure it. You could hold the interest rate exactly identical, or you could hold the stream of interest payments identical. Because we're introducing 2 months into the term of the loan, then that's going to change the effective interest rate a little bit. And it's not clear, actually, you want the clients to think about the cost of the loan in the same way, and it's not clear that clients can calculate interest rates well enough to incorporate that difference in timing. That was the bank's argument for doing it this way. But it does mean, so what we did was inadvertently kind of alter the interest rate a little bit for one group versus the other, mainly because the bank insisted on that. But again, I'm not sure that the other way would have been the right way to go. But I'll come back to that. We can do a pretty simple back-of-the-envelope calculation to show that any effects we find can't be coming just from straight income effects, from that additional interest income. Let me tell you a little bit about the clients. These are pretty typical MFI clients, at least in India, in urban India. 77% of clients, if you just ask them a straightforward question, basically, is there a business that's run out of this household? 77% of clients answer yes to that question. If you probe further and try to pick up any kind of self-employment or self-employment activity in the household, it's something like 97% of households would qualify as microenterprise, having some kind of microenterprise activity by most standard definitions. They do have very limited financial access. This bank is a monopoly lender in the area. Calcutta is an interesting city. It's not true in every Indian city, but there are kind of 3 or 4 leading MFIs, and they've kind of carved up the city into areas that they each control, and so far they respect that. So because microfinance is neighborhood-based lending, it's really the case that a person in a certain neighborhood can't go to another MFI and try to get another loan. You could obviously go to a money lender or a friend and a relative. But for the most part, people don't borrow outside of this bank in our sample. And savings rates are relatively low. So that is, they're quite dependent on this bank for liquidity. There's a high incidence of shocks, as is common in the poor urban neighborhoods in India. 60% of the clients report having experienced negative income shock over the past half year, and 42% missing days of work because of that. And in terms of what they do, these are by and large vendors, vendors of different scales, but a lot of people, so large vendors would be people who have a stall and a shop that's kind of a fixed place where they sell vegetables or sell household items. Small vendors would be people who kind of set up shop, on a cloth on the corner. Clothing sellers are typically going to be women who sell saris out of their homes, so they buy saris and invite women over, and women buy saris from them. Skilled service work is tailoring, pretty much. Piece rate can be making anything from paper bags to incense to cigarettes that they make. But these are mainly vendors. Working capital is by far the main form of business asset. An interesting aspect of these businesses is that there is evidence they're undertaking a lot of risk simply by extending a lot of credit to their customers. So 50% of these business owners, it's actually about the same. So 50% of median business sales are on credit, and about half of business owners extend credit to their clients. They also report, which was somewhat surprising, when we started investigating, I'll step back even more, because I think it's kind of interesting how projects evolve. We became interested in investigating this particular change to the credit contract because so many clients expressed a desire to have a grace period. They told us that they would make very different business investments and do things very differently if only they had a little time to generate income from that investment. And when we probed why this would be the case, why they would be change their behavior in response to simply get a little bit of flexibility in the loan contract, what turned out to be true, and which makes sense from a theoretical perspective, is that you really do need there to be a very high cost of liquidating assets. Obviously, if you could just invest in something and then resell it at cost, the next day, then there's no risk really. I mean, if you don't have the income you need and you need to make a payment, then you would just sell back whatever you purchased. As it turns out, people at least perceive there to be despite the fact that working capital is the main asset, people perceive there to be a very high cost of liquidating working capital. So we asked people, how much of your money could you get back if you had to resell all of your working capital in the next 24 hours? We asked this a few different ways. But on average, people reported a 25% loss. And so in this sense, business investments are risky, and it would take a week to liquidate. This varies by industry, but I don't think in a particularly meaningful way. So I'm not going to spend time on this. Just to give you a few more examples that really motivated us to invest a lot of time and effort into this project, despite the fact, again, that I think the prediction surprises some people, that we should really expect to see very different investment behavior based on such a small, subtle variation in credit contract type. When we talked to, these are just two people that were randomly chosen from different occupations in our client base. And the two most common occupations are sorry seller and tailor. These were both second-time borrowers who had been in business for a while. And these were both people that expressed a strong interest in a grace period. The reason that they said it would matter is, first, they did say that they typically set aside money, that there's enough risk in their investments, or their income stream, that they set aside money to make the first few payments. And so giving a grace period would have this effect on the intensive margin, that it would allow them to invest more of the loan in the business. Doing so would have some income effect because, for one reason, they would allow them to enjoy economies of scale when they purchase working capital. But they also said it wouldn't just change the amount of the investment, but it would definitely change the nature of the investment. So we would see, they both said that they would be willing to take on greater entrepreneurial risk. And I think that's where we should expect to see the biggest change in long-term profits. The sorry seller said that what she would do differently is increase the variety of saris that are sold. And so, for her, the uncertainty is exactly which saris are in demand from customers that she's not familiar with. So if she tries to expand the set of customers that she sells to, she has to experiment, and experimentation is risky. The tailor said that he would, if given time and flexibility, take on more entrepreneurial risk by trying to expand his connections and his sales in a neighboring state. And so that requires some initial period of investment in which he will not be earning income. And in the paper, we kind of set up a very simple illustrative model that's designed to show that with a few pretty simple assumptions, again, I don't want to go through the details, but if you kind of consider an entrepreneur as having access to two types of investments, a very safe investment that's enough to guarantee him the income stream that's required to repay the loan, and a risky investment that pays off a higher average return, but with some uncertainty, with some probability pays off nothing. If the person is dividing their investment across these two types of assets, and you consider two types of contracts, one with and one without a grace period in the simplest model possible, where there are just two periods, then what you can show is that with a couple of assumptions, switching to the grace period is indeed going to can increase the amount of investment, increase the average profits and the variance of profits, but also increase default. So you can get these simultaneous predictions on default and income. Okay, so let me tell you how we evaluated this intervention. We conducted numerous surveys, a baseline that was not exactly a baseline because we couldn't do it fast enough. We were forming groups in real time, and it was very hard to get to the people before the loan was given out. So the group was formed, and then pretty much the loan was dispersed. And so we have a baseline that was conducted kind of within 2 months of the loan. That turns out to actually be helpful for our purposes because it allows us to see, to better observe what people do with the money and to better observe new business formation. We did go back a year later and then 3 years later to re-interview people and find out how their businesses were doing, the size of their businesses, the average profits. But we rely on the initial baseline survey to measure the amount spent on the business and on new business formation. For default, we have access to the MFI's administrative data, so we can see a lot of details about exactly when and how much people default on. And we consider, when we define default, we're going to define it a number of different ways, but we consider 16 weeks after the loan is due in full, 24 weeks after the loan is due in full, and I think in the paper we even look at 52 weeks, a whole year after the loan is due. So we give people a long time to repay. The estimation strategy is straightforward. We're going to be interested simply in the dummy indicator being assigned to the grace period contract. So here beta is the treatment, in my terminology, is going to be the grace period treatment. The only thing that's added to this regression is dummy indicators of the batch. Because this was done dynamically, we randomized people in groups pretty much every week. So we include all those batches. And I'll show you the results with and without the time invariant controls from the baseline. Importantly, there was no dropout. So it could have been the case that when people found out what contract they were assigned to, they said, actually, I don't want the loan. That would have complicated our analysis quite a bit. Although we could have tried to find the people and done an ITT. But everybody remained everyone took up the loan. And I think this is because we had to warn people that they would be assigned to one or the other before they kind of decided to join the group. And so it's not terribly surprising. But because there was no dropout, our intent to treat estimate is going to capture the average treatment effect. Okay, so I just learned how to do this. Don't fear. Oh, but now I did it too much. This is a very small. There we go. All right, this is the effect of the loan. So every coefficient estimate here is just a coefficient estimate on beta, of beta. The top panel is without controls, and the bottom panel is with a set of kind of basic household characteristics. Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick clarifying question?
Yeah.
When you say dropout, did you mean the time the groups were formed? Very end,
from the time the groups. Well, I was referring technically to the time that people were told about their treatment assignment. That would be the time the groups are formed.
Okay.
So no one dropped out as a result of treatment assignment, or after, potentially as a result.
Until
Yeah, I actually don't think there was any dropout. There's very low dropout, and yeah, any dropout that happens during the kind of group recognition would be the bank kind of kicking someone out. Found out that they don't have as much money as the person. But we assigned people after that, and there was no one left our experiment.
Okay.
There will be some dropout with the follow-up surveys, some attrition. That's not not dropout, but we lose a few people when we try to follow them.
Is that default, or is that I'm just confused about the terminology you're using by dropout versus default versus.
Yeah, so default could be correlated with dropout. No, default and dropout are totally different. I'm talking about our experiment, dropout of our experiment, not dropout of the bank. It's more confusing because there are also people that just leave. They don't go on to the next loan cycle. No, dropout here is dropout of our experiment.
Okay.
So we don't have any dropout. In fact, we end up catching everybody eventually, but in the surveys we don't have complete. We have some attrition in the survey, but it's low, and it's not correlated. It could be correlated with default, but it's not.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. So this is survey data in which we asked people, how did you spend the money that you were given? How did you spend your loan? And they were given a variety of categories. Columns 1 and 5. 1 is all business type of expenditures, and 5 is all non-business type of expenditures. And then 2 and 3 and 4 are the different categories of business expenditures, and 6 to 8 are actually, let me do it a little smaller. 6 to 9, I think, are the different types of non-business expenditures. What we see here is that in terms of reported loan use, and obviously, there's a lot of reporting error. There's a lot of mental accounting here in terms of, people thinking about money that they spend explicitly from the loan versus money they spent at the same time as they got the loan from other sources. And so it's hard to fully interpret these, but it is worth noting that people assigned to the grace period contract do report spending more of their loan on their business. It's a small amount. It's only about 6% more of their loan. And another thing to note is that people do report spending the majority of their loan on their business. But nonetheless, you do see that immediate pattern. Now you'd have to, where is it coming out of is the obvious question. And what we would expect it to be coming out of is putting money basically under your mattress, or putting it aside to make the first few loan payments. What I'm afraid is kind of problematic about these data is that we didn't ask about that explicitly. I think, I'm embarrassed to say that we thought that savings would capture that, but clearly, even if you ask English speakers, savings doesn't capture kind of putting money aside that you're immediately going to be using for repayment. And so I think what happened, and we did constrain people to account for all of their loan, and so I think we have people kind of shuffling things around in a way that I wouldn't interpret as meaningful, but I will note that what people report spending less money on is home repairs. You could interpret that as a very safe investment, I don't think that's exactly the correct. It's also a highly illiquid investment, so I don't think that's the correct interpretation. So I would just take from here that people do at least think of themselves as spending more money on their business when they are given a grace period. And this motivated us to go through with the kind of expensive aspect of the project, which is following people 3 years later. Let me say the one other thing. I have to fancy keyboard stuff. The one other thing that we observe here, which is more in line with the kind of changes in business investment that we are anticipating, is that we do see a significantly higher rate of new business formation among grace period clients. Now, the rate of new business formation, and this is in the 6 months around when you got the loan, it's low. So the baseline rate is only 2.4% of the sample report starting a new business. But that rate is double among the clients in the grace period contract. As I said, that motivated us to track the clients 3 years later. And we invested a lot in trying to maintain a high response rate, and achieved a 91% response rate, which is balanced across the treatment arms, and I should have put this up here, but importantly, it's not correlated with default. And the main objective of the survey was to see whether these small changes in investment, or the small rate of new business formation, could have a visible effect on poverty and microenterprise size 3 years later. And there's kind of two ways to think about it. You might think that 3 years is a long time for very small differences in investment to persist. There are big shocks in this environment, and these small differences in investment will be dwarfed by these larger things that are going on in the background. The other kind of perspective is that 3 years is a long time for small differences in investment to compound. I mean, if people are reinvesting their profits, that gives them a very long time to slowly grow a small business. And so we really were kind of agnostic about which of those stories would prevail in this setting. So we measured profits and household income. We did measure profits. There are two ways you can measure profits. You can go in and collect very detailed information about business income and business costs. It's hard to do because you have to get people to do kind of a lot of accounting, account for their inventories, think about the volume of sales and in the correct unit. And then you can calculate profits. Or you can just ask people, what was your average weekly profits? Now, there's a large literature which has shown that the average weekly profit measure works pretty much just as well as the other one. If anything, it seems to be a less noisy measure of profits. We have both, and they show basically the same results. What I'm going to present to you is this simple measure of average weekly profits. And we measured income the same way. So this was during the past 30 days, what was the total household income? Is that large enough, or can you see that? Okay. So what we found, in a nutshell, is a big difference 3 years later in household income. So households that had been assigned to the grace period contract reported 18% or 18 to 20% higher income, household income, 3 years later. And all of this can be accounted for by a difference in average weekly profits. So if you then look in columns, columns 1 and columns 2 are the trimmed and untrimmed estimates of the same outcome. So columns 1 and 2 are both log household income. The trimmed is on the right. And the columns 3 and 4 are average weekly profits. So if you take that difference in average weekly profits as a fraction of household income, all of the difference in income can be accounted for by the difference in average weekly profits, which is what you would expect. We don't expect small changes in business investment to lead to differences in salaried income, for instance. And what you also see if you look in columns 5 and 6, although it's not entirely robust, that is, we only see it when we trim I think we're trimming only 4 observations, kind of the 4 big outliers. But when you do that, you do see a significant difference in the variance of average weekly profits. And the other thing, which is not on this slide, but I think is kind of even more compelling, is that you can measure variance by looking at the difference between the highest and the average profits in the high season and average profits in the low season, so within person. And you also see the significantly higher variance of profits among people assigned to the grace period. Now, the major caveat with that, with thinking about variance of profits, and also what I'm going to show you about business practices, is that, of course, the predictions are about risk and variance of profits immediately after you invest, immediately after you receive the loan. By the 3-year mark, these are significantly more profitable, larger businesses, and so we might just be seeing higher variance of profits or different practices because of the size of the business. So it's consistent with our hypothesis, but it's hard to say whether that's a kind of a causal effect of investment incentives or just the growth of the business. If you look at the size of the business, speaking of growth of the business, you can measure that in various ways. We measure the total value of raw materials and inventory, value of equipment, and number of employees, and see that, consistent with the profit results, clients that have been assigned to the grace period are operating much larger microenterprises. Very few of these are large enough to qualify as SMEs. But that's mainly because SMEs, I think the qualification is about number of people you work for, and what you don't see is much expansion in terms of the number of workers. But I think that it makes perfect sense that we would see businesses expanding on the margin of equipment and inventory before they expand in terms of employees, just because of market imperfections in terms of hiring outside labor. So most of the employees in these businesses are family members. So business turnover is an interesting result. So our prior was that we would see, because we see a higher variance of income, and we expect to see clients assigned to the grace period taking on more business risk, that we should see higher rates of closure, higher rates of business failure among the grace period clients. So what column 6 is a measure of whether or not at least one of the business, one business in the household that was in existence between baseline and follow-up closed in this period. And what you actually see is a negative, marginally significant effect of being assigned to the grace period on business closure. And the one story that's consistent with that is this idea of liquidity, this idea that people are taking on more risk precisely because they're investing in assets that are harder to liquidate. And the story there would be that, when they're faced with a shock, instead of liquidating the assets and repaying the loan or paying off the health cost, they don't liquidate the business, and so fewer businesses fail. And that's consistent with a survey question that we asked about whether or not the client, this is column 7, had ever sold off goods or services at a discount in order to make a loan payment. And indeed, the clients also report doing this less often. And so that's our interpretation of the negative business closure result. Finally, I told you we have some measure of a willingness to undertake business risk. And again, the caveat is that these are not ideal because they're measured 3 years later. And so they're not necessarily reflective of risk-taking behavior when the businesses were on average the same size. But it still is, it's interesting that you do see clients assigned to the grace period reporting much more willingness to extend credit to their customers, both in terms of whether or not they do that and the fraction of their customers that buy on credit. They report much more willingness to allow customers to pre-order goods and services. And finally, they report a wider variance of business activities associated with each business, measured as the number of goods and services that business provides. So we interpret that as a measure of risk. You might think of that as as diversifying the portfolio and therefore lowering the risk of the business. But I think it's better interpreted as, just based on conversations with these clients, as experimentation, that these vendors are experimenting with new product lines, or the tailors are offering an additional service. But it's a little bit ambiguous. And finally, we come to default. And just as we predicted, although on average, so keep in mind that the business results that I showed you before are for all clients, not just non-defaulters, but everybody. So on average, people assigned to the grace period are better off. They're wealthier. They have bigger businesses doing better. But there is a large, significant difference in default. So the baseline rate of default in the control group, among the clients that were assigned to the regular contract, is exactly what it is among clients on average in this bank. It's only 4%. That's actually high by microfinance standards, but this is an incredibly low by small business loan standards in a developed country. 4% of clients default on their loan, especially when you take into account how conservative the measure of default is here. I mean, it doesn't mean that on average, I think on average the people default on only like 10% of the loan, so they're not kind of running away with large amounts of money. A lot of them are paying most of it back eventually. In the grace period group, you see that rate triple. So the rate in the grace period group is 12%. So there's a large increase in default among those assigned to the grace period. This falls a little bit, so that default rate is high if you look within 8 weeks of loan repayment. But even if you look 52 weeks later, the default rates, so by then in the control group, almost everybody's repaid. 98% of people have repaid their loan, and in the grace period group, 93% of people have repaid their loan, or 92. And this is actually when we act. We are working with this bank, who is a wonderful partner, largely because they're interested in changing their practices and tweaking their contract, and they want advice from us about what they can do better. But this was exactly their fear, was that if you extend flexibility to clients, then and they weren't so much interested in the effect on clients' income, but you will see much higher default. Now their interpretation is very different. What they think of it is about something like habit formation. They think that microfinance clients need to develop fiscal discipline, and if you give them flexibility, then they'll start, becoming irresponsible repayers. In fact, that our evidence is not consistent with that story at all. One way you can look at that is kind of a habit formation story would suggest that if you give people 2 months off, then they will immediately start missing payments. Like they might not show up for the first meeting, or they'll forget to come to that, 9-week repayment. Really, it looks like these people are just as likely to make the first loan payment, and they're defaulting, in response to shocks kind of throughout the loan cycle. So it doesn't look like it's a change in habit formation. So let me try to speed up a little bit. I'm just going to show you a few robustness checks. So just to summarize, we find that introducing a small grace period leads to an increase in business spending, long-run income and profits are higher, and there's significantly higher default. Now, there are a few competing explanations for some of these findings. I will say that there's not kind of one story you can give that would explain both of these, both the higher income and the higher default. But you can account for those two differences between grace period and non-grace period clients in a few different ways. So let me try to convince you that our interpretation is correct. So one concern, as I said before, is that it's true that the present value of loan payments for the grace period clients is slightly higher because they have 2 more months. It's a 10-month contract, and we give these guys a year to repay. So can that difference in income explain the results? Are these people just investing that additional interest income into their business, and is that why we're seeing differences in investment and profits? The paper goes through the details, but even very conservative assumptions about reinvestment. So that is like if you reinvest everything in your business, you can explain only very little of the difference in capital stock at endline. So it really, we could maybe that's some of what's going on, but that can explain only about 20% of what we see. Another possibility is that default is creating more income, so that when you default, there's some money that you abscond with, you run away with some money, and that is kind of an income effect. Is it just that for some reason the default is different, maybe because of habit formation, maybe because they were sent a signal by the bank that the bank didn't really care about repayment, and because they defaulted, they have more money and they invest that in the business, and that's why the business is growing. So that's even smaller. I mean, as I said before, people are actually defaulting on very small amounts of their loans, and so the treatment group doesn't have that much additional income because of default. So that can explain only 2% of the observed capital stock difference. And finally, the kind of back of the envelope calculation that we do just to convince ourselves that what we see is reasonable, mainly because 18% higher income is a very large number, and so what we wanted to do was spend some time making sure that the mechanism that we highlight in the model and in the discussion could actually, reasonably explain the differences that we observe if we take every amount literally in the paper. So what we do is just take literally the difference in business expenditure, which is that 650 rupees is a very small amount. So suppose that's the only difference. There's no difference in the type. So let's just say that they spend 650 more rupees on business. So what difference in rate of returns would be required to generate the observed differences in capital stock? And you can do this calculation in a number of ways with different assumptions regarding the rate of reinvestment. So if you take one extreme and suppose they reinvest everything into their business, so all the additional profits are reinvested, then 3 years is a really long time, so everything compounds, and very small differences in interest rates are required to explain the differences in capital stock. So you could consider the people in the control group receive a return on capital that's only 2 percentage points higher, and that would explain the observed differences in capital stock. If you go on the other extreme and assume a smaller propensity to consume out of, or larger propensity to consume out of investment income, then it's required to have a slightly larger gap in the return on capital. But the difference in the return on capital is quite consistent with what people have found when they've measured experimentally the returns to capital in developing countries. So the point of this exercise is just to convince ourselves that this is a reasonable number, despite the fact that it's large. We're talking about a difference, a rate of return on capital of, say, 4% in the control group and 12% in the treatment group. Now, that's a large difference in returns to capital, but it's not, again, inconsistent with what people have found in other settings. So I think, just to conclude, I think the important lessons from here are that small changes in the microfinance contract could have large implications for the potential for microfinance to encourage microenterprise growth and investment. And so before we write off microfinance as just an ineffective instrument for encouraging small business formation or encouraging microenterprise expansion, we should think about ways to change the contract such that it incentivizes micro-entrepreneurs to invest in to take on risk. The caveat is that taking on risk does mean that there are going to be some losers. So I think we need to sort of decide ethically how much of that we want to support. I think the broader point is just that if you want to reduce poverty through entrepreneurship, then you do sort of need to encourage a certain amount of risk-taking. Now, in a setting without social safety nets, that's a little bit of a complicated thing to encourage. But I think the basic point is that if you don't encourage people to take risks, then you can't really expect small businesses to bring people out of poverty. They might smooth consumption, they might keep people going in tough times, but this is not going to be a source of income growth for the poor. And it feeds directly into the policy debate in India right now, but I think the policy debate kind of extends worldwide about how much to regulate microfinance and how to regulate microfinance. Unfortunately, the regulations that are being pushed these days are really about interest rate caps. And what our paper suggests is that that's exactly what you don't want to do. Capping the interest rate is just going to discourage people even more, or discourage MFIs from introducing flexible contracts. The way that an MFI could incorporate some of our lessons is by offering different contracts and at different interest rates, and allowing entrepreneurs who would like a more flexible contract to pay slightly higher interest rates, which they should be perfectly willing to pay based on the higher profits that they experience. And in fact, when we ask them in survey data and then poll them in focus groups, clients are willing to pay quite a bit more for a more flexible contract. The current interest rate regulations and the regulation environment in India right now, however, would not allow any of that kind of creativity in microfinance credit contracts. And so that's, I think, the important policy point. So I am happy to take any questions, and again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present.